Hello and welcome to another video in Foundations of Maternal and Newborn Health. In today's video, we're going to be talking about iron absorption, and we'll also be talking about anemia. Okay, so quickly before we begin, I'll just go over what absorption is. So when you absorb nutrients from food, you're taking the nutrients out of your gastrointestinal tract or out of your stomach and intestines, and you're bringing those nutrients into the blood. Okay, so when we're talking about iron absorption, iron usually comes from red meat. So red meat is the best source of iron for your body. So red meat is anything that's meat is red when it's raw. So this would be like beef or, lamb, those sorts of things. And so these foods are really high in iron, and iron that our body likes to absorb. So if this is our gastrointestinal tract, I've used this diagram before. So if the iron comes down from the mouth into the stomach, and then it goes through the intestines, and in the intestines, the iron gets absorbed into the blood. So the iron gets pulled out of your stomach and intestines and into the blood. And it's actually helped in this process by some vitamins. So vitamins B12 and vitamin B9 are some of the vitamins that help. And for those of you who remember, vitamin B9 we talked about in another video. This is folate. Which helps in preventing neural tube defects. And so folate is helpful not just for when you're pregnant and you're growing a baby, but also all the time when you're absorbing iron. And so once this iron is absorbed into the blood, it's actually carried over to your bones. And so this is a diagram of a bone. This is a bone. And you can imagine that I've cut this section of the bone, I've cut it in half, kind of lengthwise, to expose the inside of the bone. And in red here, I've drawn, this is the bone marrow. Bone marrow. And the bone marrow has the important job of making red blood cells. And we'll call them RBCs from now on, RBCs. They also make white blood cells, or your immune cells as well. They make other cells, but for today's purposes, the bone marrow makes red blood cells. So the iron is carried to the bone marrow, and it's carried by a helper protein that we'll talk about in another video. And then your bone marrow takes that iron and it turns it into red blood cells carrying hemoglobin. And it's actually the hemoglobin that has the iron in it. So hemoglobin, and that hemoglobin is carried by the red blood cells. And so if you recall, we talked about hemoglobin in the gas exchange video, and hemoglobin carries oxygen around your body. Okay, so that's kind of the whole process of iron in your body. You eat it, and then it's turned into your red blood cells and turned into hemoglobin. But there's a disease called anemia that happens if you don't have enough iron, or specifically enough red blood cells. So not enough red blood cells. So there are many different causes to anemia. We'll talk about some of them today, but there are many, many causes. These aren't all important to know. So you can get anemia from things like cancer. You can get anemia from an infection. So if you're sick, you can even get anemia. You can get anemia from some genetic diseases. So you can be born with a genetic disease that causes anemia. So if your hemoglobin, for example, this guy, your hemoglobin is all messed up, the protein, your DNA doesn't encode for a protein that works very well, you can have anemia. There's also hemolytic anemia. So this is when your white blood cells actually attack your red blood cells and kill them. Anyways, the most important type of anemia, though, or the most common and the most important for us, is actually iron deficient anemia. Iron deficient anemia. And kind of off of this branch of iron deficient anemia, we have kind of vitamin deficient anemia as well. And we talked about how vitamin B12 and B9, and there are other vitamins as well that help with how iron's absorbed. If you don't have enough of those vitamins, you can also become anemic. So hopefully these two make sense, these two here. So if you don't have enough iron in your diet, so that's what deficient means, is not enough in your diet. If you don't have enough iron in your diet, then you don't get this iron absorption. And the bone marrows don't have any iron to make hemoglobin. So your body doesn't have enough hemoglobin, and without the hemoglobin, you don't have red blood cells either. And so this leads to your body becoming anemic or not having enough red blood cells. So there's just a couple more things that I wanted to talk about when it comes to iron absorption and anemia. So the first is that studies have actually shown that anemia is very common in Inuit communities. So it's about 8 times higher in Inuit communities than in non-Inuit communities. So the rest of Canada. And so it's important that we try to address these issues of anemia in these Inuit communities, because low anemia can cause lots of problems, and we'll talk about in the next video how anemia can cause problems in pregnancy, but anemia can also cause issues for, growing boys or teenagers or kids in general. And so we can treat anemia with diet, of course, if it's needed. And specifically these types of anemias, we can treat with diet. So we can give more iron or more vitamins that help absorb the iron. And we can also give medications. We can give iron containing medications that really boost up the iron that you absorb. The last thing that I wanted to mention is that anemia is also much worse in pregnancy. So anemia worse in pregnancy. And this is because of a few reasons. We'll talk about this a little bit more in the next video. But when you're growing a baby, the baby takes some iron from the mom. So baby takes iron from mom. Okay, so the baby's taking away some of this iron from mom, and so if the baby's taking some of the iron, mom has less iron to make hemoglobin and red blood cells. Mother also just needs to make a lot more blood. So you just need more blood during pregnancy, and this is called hemodilution. It doesn't matter what it's called, but basically you need a lot more blood when you're pregnant, and so this dilutes out your red blood cells. It makes them, you can imagine as red blood cells as kind of boats in the sea, and if you have a lot more water, if there's just a bigger sea, your red blood cells don't take up as much space. And so because you need a lot more blood, you need a lot more volume of blood, your proportion of red blood cells decreases, and so you're more likely to be anemic for that reason as well during pregnancy.